Just looking at the agenda, we're going to have some follow-ups from the 329 work session talking about and arts and culture. We're going to have some analysis of our FY22 forecasted year-end projections, FY23 revenues and expenditures, have some discussion about fund balance and financial outlook, and last, some discussion about capital projects. So I think we're going to get started with the follow-ups from the 329 work session. First item is the community centers. Is that where you want to start?
We have a couple opening slides that will start. That's fine.
Hey, John.
Okay. Welcome to our second budget work session. So just to review our timeline, we held our retreat in December. Our first work session was on March 29th, where we brought you many expenditure drivers for the first pass budget. We are now here at our second work session. In 2 weeks, we will have our third work session, which we'll hear from our education partners and those fire districts who are requesting a rate increase. On May 19th, Thursday, we intend to provide a recommended budget accompanied by a budget message. We will have a public hearing on the budget on June 7th, plan for adoption of the budget on June 21st. So today's agenda will begin with some follow-ups from our last session on which you had questions. Tim Love will provide an update on community centers. Rachel Nygaard will provide some feedback regarding arts and culture. After that, we'll discuss what you have in your packet and allow for questions on those items. We'll then dig into our budget agenda, beginning with a projection of where we expect to finish the current fiscal year, discuss revenues for fiscal year 2023, discuss expenditures for fiscal year 2023, including changes we've made since the first pass budget. We're now calling this the fiscal year 23 second pass budget. We will discuss balancing the expenditures and revenues for fiscal year 23, and then move to a discussion of fund balance with Sam Riddle. We'll look at our financial outlook, discuss capital projects and debt with Don Warren, and then wrap up with our next steps. So moving to our follow-ups from our March 29th work session. Tim Love will join us.
Good morning, commissioners. I appreciate that. That was a good response. So you asked for an update on community centers, and so we have some preliminary information to share with you. This will continue to evolve as we go. But to get started, when we met with you in, I guess, the December working session, there was a proposal about how to move forward with community centers. So we'll update you first on that. And so as you can see on the screen, our approach was pretty simple. Take a look at the community centers that are owned by the county, of which there are 4, and those are listed on the screen. They include Sandy Mush, Big Ivy, Bent Creek, and Beach. And get out to those community centers and do a basic assessment of those facilities. And so we did that, and our methodology was pretty basic. We created a cross-departmental team, and that team included recreation services staff, general services staff, and then our safety officer. To really try to touch the basics, recreation opportunities, building maintenance, but also compliance with safety. We made a list of all the issues that were identified in those community centers, and then assess those issues on a 5-point scale, which is the typical approach that our general services department takes with any asset that we look at. The 5-point scale, 1 is a repair immediately, so a priority 1 is something that should have been done yesterday. Priority 5 is something that's like new, really doesn't need any focus. And from there, we said, let's take a look at all of these issues and figure out which ones need to get done immediately and which ones can wait. Clearly, everything doesn't need to get addressed. And so the deliverables out of this would be the main deliverable, a 5 to 10 year plan to remediate the issues identified. And so we've worked on that plan. We're not done yet. We've got some more work to do. But for us, the focus was always on making sure we address priority one issues. What are the key health, safety, risk issues that need to get addressed? And so when we talk about an estimated start date, for those issues that are major priorities, emergencies, we've already started. Those items have already been addressed. Examples of those could be fire code violations related to exits, things like that. So we've already begun to work those. However, when we start talking about priority 2 through 5, that's where some additional work is needed. And so I can't tell you which priority 2s are going to get done in 2024. I can tell you they don't need to get done today, and that's the key. As is obvious, this aligns well with our strategic plan as we talk about resident well-being and expanding and maintaining our cultural and recreational assets. To give you a feel for the results of the assessment, total of issues identified across those 4 county-owned community centers, about 108 issues. You can see the issues by community center, so a little bit of a spread with Big Ivy having the majority of the issues, some of those being pool related. Bent Creek sort of being a little bit easier to deal with, but also want to note that there's no real buildings there. It's more of an outdoor shelter, so a little bit easier. Again, from like the critical perspective, what are our priority 1 issues? Overall, we identified 46 of those, and those broke out into 17 in the improvement section and 29 in the safety section. That's our overall results. In terms of our next steps, we want to address those priority 1 issues as soon as possible. So go ahead and program those out if they haven't already been fixed, and then continue to work with general services to plan for those in the future. And so what we've looked at, we've just got some preliminary cost estimates. We're only cost estimating at this point the priority 1 issues because those are right in front of us. And so to resolve those priority 1 issues across the 4 community centers, it's about $150,000. And so that's something that that type of funding we've arranged with general services would live in their budget because they would execute the repairs or contract directly if needed. But that's kind of to get to the point. 47 priority 1s for about $150,000. Those issues stretch across, electrical, exits, fire safety, things like that. Y'all have any questions?
Thank you for that update. That sounds real promising, and it's great to know that you're already in the process of addressing those issues that need to be addressed.
So we'll continue to work with general services. Just as a note, we're taking a similar approach with our parks, and that same, we've already assessed our parks as well, and we're working through the prioritization there, but you'll see similar information in the future.
Thanks.
Good morning, Commissioners. Rachel Nygaard here with updates in response to your conversation on March 29th related to arts and culture. As we listened to the discussion that Commissioners had during that session, you articulated several issues related to funding, county funding specifically for this sector, namely that Blanford County does not have a dedicated funding process related to arts and culture, meaning that organizations seeking county funding for those types of services must apply to the broader county grant programs that are in place, which do operate on a competitive basis, which leads to that uncertainty or that fluctuation of county funding to this sector from year to year, and comes with an additional constraint, which is that those competitive grant programs operate with certain limitations, like no more than 3 years of funding for a single project. That's an example of a limitation that's in the strategic partnership grant. As we began gathering follow-up information for the board, first we started by looking at legal authority, as we do. North Carolina counties do have clear legal authority to fund arts programs and museums operated by community organizations. They are not mandated county services. So it's in that area where counties may act, and it's up to counties to decide if to fund, at what level, and through what mechanism. So different counties handle this differently, and Buncombe County has handled it differently over time. Another piece of the conversation was related to directly contracting with organizations, and commissioners asked us to bring back some specific information related to that. And so I'll go into more information on the next slide, but beginning, just to ground us in county policy, we do have a procurement policy for a county that recommends competitive bidding as the best practice way to ensure the best use of county funds in the most equitable and inclusive way. That competitive bidding is required for service contracts at a certain dollar threshold, $90,000 and above. And as a best practice, we try to do competitive bidding as much as possible for outside awards. So county, this is how the contract funding works. County departments may choose to contract with outside organizations, including nonprofits, not only nonprofits, to either purchase goods or purchase services in alignment with that county procurement policy that I just mentioned. And so the contracts that are put in place have certain items within the structure, activities, deliverables, reporting measures, etc. And that information is used for evaluating performance and potential renewal of any contracts. And that evaluation is incorporated into our annual cycle this time of year during the budgeting process, looking at what contracts might be in place for the coming year. During your conversation in March, you asked about a couple of economic development related contracts and how those work. So the economic development budget includes funding for 2 organizations that advance departmental goals. And these are approved through the board's process for economic development hearings. So you do vote on these as well. There's a slide on each of the 2 that are included in that budget. The first one is EDC, or Economic Development Coalition. There's some basic information about the structure and scope of that contract. It's a $400,000 agreement that you can see is related to workforce development, economic and labor analysis, and other economic outcomes. I have a pretty quiet voice, so thank you, Max, for the new mic. So $400,000 to EDC, budgeted as part of the annual budget in the Economic Development Cost Center and evaluated by the Intergovernmental Relations Director, who you just heard from moments ago. The other contract that sits in that cost center is the Sports Commission, the Asheville Buncombe Sports Commission. And this is a $45,000 contract that has 2 components. The SoCon, which is the basketball Southern Conference tournament sponsorship fee, as well as additional sporting events. Resulting, you can see the kinds of measurements that are collected around direct spending and jobs created and taxes generated. And this is established and evaluated at that department. So back to arts and culture. Another part of the follow-up request was, what have we seen in our current grant requests for the upcoming year related to arts and culture? So we looked at the 2 grant programs that tend to see arts related, strategic partnership grants and tipping point grants. Where we are in the cycle is that those are currently under review. The review committees will produce their recommendations by the end of April. So we're nearly through with their process, but those are not quite ready. They will be presented to the Board of Commissioners in your budget message that you received from the county manager in May. Of the $2.8 million that was requested in those two grant programs spanning across all of the county focus areas, education, environment, well-being, economy, there's $1 million to allocate to that roughly $3 million worth of requests. A subset of those requests, we went through and tagged what seemed to fit with the arts and culture classification, and there's examples of the kinds of programs and services listed on your screen. So events, performing arts, museums, etc. A side note is that during the review conversations, multiple committees have talked about the challenge in scoring arts and culture programs in the same process as scoring basic human needs services. Arts and culture fit under resident well-being within our strategic plan focus area. We also have health and safety and other basic needs also under resident well-being, which creates a competitive environment for those art programs. Like I said, we don't know yet what the recommendations are going to be from the committee. And looking at the initial scoring, the arts and culture programs haven't tended to score as high as the basic human needs. You asked for options. Here are 4. There's pros and cons listed for each. And these options are intended to consider addressing the issues that were articulated at the beginning. So, of course, one option is to continue business as usual, no change, to fund arts and culture through the existing competitive grant programs that other nonprofits would apply to. It is budget neutral. That's good news when there's already a second passed budget in place without special dedicated arts funding. And it does not address the stated issues. Another budget neutral option is the second one, is to go into an existing grant program like the Strategic Partnership Grants, which is a $100,000 grant, and earmark a portion of that specifically to arts and culture. That would be budget neutral. It wouldn't be able to start for this coming fiscal year for FY23 because the committees have already engaged in their review process using the current structure. It would also be somewhat tricky to implement because strategic partnerships that has no other earmarks. We haven't directed that committee, for example, to equalize funding between environment, economy, well-being, etc. A third and fourth option that are presented here are not budget neutral. They would require new expense and would more thoroughly address the issues that were brought up. One option is to establish a new pool of funds for arts and culture, like we do for community recreation or affordable housing or early childhood, and run essentially a grant program specifically to that type of program and service. So it creates that specialized fund. It does come with an administrative burden to design and oversee a new grant program. A fourth option is to do a sort of block grant, if you will, which is to still create a specialized process for the sector, yet have a third party or outside organization administer that. We do have a dedicated arts agency in Buncombe County. That's the Asheville Area Arts Council, and they do administer regranting programs. When we look at other counties in North Carolina, we did not have time for a thorough analysis, but did some preliminary looking at how do other North Carolina counties work with their designated arts agencies. And 8 out of the 10 most populous counties in the state do provide direct funding to the Arts Council for regranting to support the sector. And the amount is quite a range, from around 4 cents per capita to $1.80 something per capita, which gives the range for Buncombe when applied to our population of around $10,000 a year to up to $500,000. So there's a lot of different ways that this could be implemented. This is a spectrum of options, and we aren't bringing forth a recommendation. We are prepared to implement any of these options, and I have spoken with the Arts Council around their capacity should the county desire to partner with them. We would, of course, use the contracting policy to establish that agreement and handle it more like a block. Questions?
Rachel, could you repeat which process does the bulk of the counties in the state use?
The funding to the local arts agency, which is equivalent to the fourth choice.
Thanks. This is really helpful. Just, I think 2 quick questions. One, when we're talking arts and culture, is that inclusive of STEM-based organizations like AMIS or the Nature Center?
This review was focused on arts and culture sector, not education.
Okay.
But we could take a look at K-12 educational support outcomes. What I heard was museums and made sure that museums were incorporated.
Yeah.
I did not do a review around science, technology, engineering, math with the STEM programs. We do have an education support cost center and an education focus area, and we could do a similar review if we wanted to do education outcomes.
I would be interested in having that broad umbrella to really think about all the arts, cultural, STEM institutions we have locally. So I guess that would be one request, that we sort of start slightly broaden the focus to include the ways we're approaching organizations like that. And then is the primary rationale around the block grant that that agency has the issue area expertise to really sort of best administer those grants?
That's right.
Yeah.
Arts councils tend to be a system-focused or sector-focused organization. They don't produce art themselves, but they support arts organizations and artists. And rebranding is a typical service that arts councils do across the state and across the country.
And we've never historically done that.
Here and there, through the annual grants program, the
We've
Arts
made grants
Council
to them, but we haven't.
has applied
Yes,
and
our
occasionally received.
Right.
And the American Rescue Plan Act was at one time. I think
Right.
it was a $50,000 funding.
Right.
For a similar reason.
Oh no, well, just to close the loop on this, I think within these options, that's the one that sort of rises top of the list for me on first pass. But also just want to make sure we are thinking more broadly about the STEM-based organizations as well.
So just to clarify, Commissioner, I heard 2 organizations that the AMIS, Ashland Museum of Science, and WNC Nature Center. Are there other organizations you specifically have in mind when you say STEM?
Those are the ones I can think of in this moment that have that kind of institutional presence where they have facility, high rates of people, local folks participating in programming.
Those are the 2 that come to mind for me too. I'm not sure if there's other. And I'll.
Two.
Yeah.
Rich, when you look at the other 10 like size that were doing something similar, how did they approach educational museums?
We'd like to have some additional follow-up and time to have
That's
conversations with other counties. I did look at would museums fit within the arts and culture spectrum, and the answer is yes. If we want to switch and have a different or expanded focus to support again for education, that's a different lens than I would use.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I appreciate the time that you've invested into looking at this for us, and great questions asked by my colleagues here. Moving forward, I'm very interested in looking at the particular block grant. I think there's opportunity for us to better work with the Asheville Arts Council as our county designated arts agency. And I'm particularly concerned and want to be very considerate about not putting more administrative burden on staff at this point. Very well aware of how understaffed each department is and want to make this as easy as possible.
Question about the STEM stuff. That's a good question. So that is sort of does seem sort of outside what an arts organization would have. familiarity or kind of their mission is about. I can't think of the others besides those two off the top of my head, so it is maybe a small, and the Nature Center, of course, is operated by the city government, it's not a nonprofit. So but even with like within the arts and culture, and this is just reflecting, you know, I don't know. When I think about the Arts Council, and you can be totally wrong about this. So does their organization and mission and like the board of directors and how it's, you know, kind of populated, look at the full scope of arts stuff? I think of more of it like in a way as like a makers kind of focused organization, like artists who, you know, create things as opposed to like, you know, theater or other like, you know, music and things like that. So do we know that, or is that something we would need to look at too? So that if we did kind of look at them as like, hey, we want to ask y'all to help us with like different kinds of work in the space, that it's the full spectrum of like, you know, like we looked at that, you know, the theater project a couple of years ago and did the funding towards that project, if I recall correctly. So to kind of look at the full, you know, scope of different things that could fall in that category.
Yep, so the Arts Council has a focus across all, I think it's 74 sectors in the overall arts field, including the creative jobs, and I can't name all of the other sectors or you know, the categories of them for you, but we can research that. And if it's a county defined program, we also have the opportunity to define the parameters. So we could name performing arts, or we could name cultural programs in addition to creative jobs.
Yeah, okay, great.
Commissioners, as we go back and try to finalize budgets, is there a number in your mind that you have for this specific funding? We gave some options as budget neutral or additional monies to the budget that we would then look to allocate in a different way. So where are you thinking?
So I'll say I'm supportive of looking at the block grant. I feel like that's the way to go, and I appreciate your time on this. And I do believe that they are pretty inclusive, the arts organization. I don't have a number in my mind yet. It's information, and I guess, yeah, I think about.
Did you want us to come back with what we see as we do research with a number?
I think
Yeah,
Like a recommendation.
Okay. Thank you.
I like the block grant too, and I think though, when we look at a number, couldn't we also look at those organizations that we're already funding and get some idea? I mean, you know, how much we're giving them?
Well, and those that we're not funding but are coming through the strategic partnership grant process, at least
Correct.
that's a starting point,
Right.
just to look at what they're requesting,
Yeah.
whether it's been funded or not.
It was about $250,000 that was requested for FY23 for all arts and culture across those 12 different projects, which does include Amos. There's an easy request in there. I don't know off the top of my head if the Nature Center.
Never funded Nature Center.
So if there's a desire by the Board of Commissioners, we always have the ability to name a specific organization and add them to the budget. We're not coming forward with naming a specific recipient of a grant, just a process for the overall arts and culture grants.
So do you recall ballpark how much, so that's what the request is, like how much arts and culture funding is in the current strategic partners, like for this year, it's already been approved, like how much funding did that sector get?
It fluctuates, and it's low.
I think my overarching concern, though, moving toward this direction, is what these funds would take away from that we also want to make sure are done. And I don't think there's any way to specifically ensure that these funds are directly benefiting people who live in Buncombe County specifically. I mean, a lot of the arts organizations do bring people in from outside our area. And so that's an overarching concern of mine, is I want to make sure if we're funding these particular programs, particularly as we look into extending into STEM, not that folks who don't live here shouldn't benefit, but at the end of the day, I want to make sure that the funds that we are allocating truly are supporting people who live in Buncombe County.
Could that be where the contract come into play?
Great question.
Yeah, we could specifically. I mean, we could state in that, yeah.
We'll come back with some follow-up at our next.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah. All right, the next bullet point on the agenda is called "What's in your packet?" Let's take a look.
So, and this list has grown, the things in your packet, the list has grown a little since we made the list that's up on the slide. So in your packet, you will find a memo from our planning director, Nate Pennington, regarding sidewalks. That's intended to answer some questions that came up at our last work session. There's also a list of nonprofit organizations with which we currently contract and information about how we procure those services. You will find a handout regarding headcount by year in response to your questions about how many positions have been approved in prior years. There's a school funding handout to address some questions we received about school appropriations, sales tax distributions, and capital funding for schools. There is a list of requested positions in there for the FY23 budget and which positions remain in the FY23 second pass budget. There is also information that we just received late Friday from the schools, from both school systems, on questions that you asked. I think I sent that out via email yesterday morning. So that is also in this packet as well. And then lastly, you will find the fee schedule for fiscal year 23. This is a draft. Changes to the fees are on pages 4 and 5 of that document. And we have some staff here who are available to answer questions regarding those changes if you have it. So I'll let y'all sit with that for a little and let me know what you have.
So one question I have, just, a lot of great information here, so I'm looking forward to reviewing it in more detail. On the issue about the retention rates in the school system, so I see there's some data here for the county schools and data on the state schools. It's just at a high level, based on what we're learning here. Are we seeing that there's any significant changes happening over the last year or two in this, or fairly, fairly steady, or any high level observations on that question?
I don't know that we have that answer. Once we dig into this material, we will have conversations with the schools before midterm.
That'd be great, because I can see there's some, some longer term data here, and that's useful to see. I think we kind of hear anecdotally that there's concern about that, but I just wonder if there's data to look at, has there been some significant changes in the last, 6, 12, 18 months, that kind of thing. All right.
I certainly appreciate the historical perspective from one of our school systems versus just the percentage. This is kind of a year over year take on it.
All right. Well, should we keep moving, or did you want to spend more time looking at or going over any of this right
This
now?
is you to take and review and some questions. But before we move on to the rest of the agenda, lunch is here. So if you want to break, get your lunch, and then we can work through, we can do that as well.
That sounds great. Why don't we take?
Now, the folks here for the fee schedule changes are here if you have any questions. If you don't, I'll excuse them.
Is now the time to talk about the sidewalks and these various memos, or?
Yeah. If you have any initial questions, we could definitely have some initial discussion now.
Yeah, I guess my comment on sidewalks and bike lanes as well is just that to kind of reiterate what Brownie said last time, that I do think we need to start including, a line item for construction of both sidewalks and bike lanes for construction and development in, the urbanized areas of Buncombe County, and work with the city of Asheville to fund those projects together. As we're learning more about NCDOT and their budget struggles, they're just not going to be able to fund this kind of infrastructure moving forward. So it's something we're going to have to take on ourselves.
And so it's correct that we haven't obviously read all this yet. So we're going to be when there's new highway projects or road improvement projects, we do have a policy to encourage, support inclusion of sidewalks under new projects, and there's a local financial match required to supplement the DOT money on that, which we have to pony up. So on the new construction projects, we do have some policies in place that, in general, we're going to try to get sidewalks built when there's new construction going on for road improvements. Do I have that basically right?
So we've had some recent changes in regards to NCDOT policy through their Complete Streets program. Now, what that essentially does is when they do a widening project, or say there's a new road section, as long as we identify that that's a needed linkage, they will construct a path or a sidewalk as part of that project. But to Commissioner Sloan's point, there was just recently a release, and there will be cuts around the $1 billion mark to projects within Buncombe County through the state transportation improvement program. Those projects that have been identified. This is not new news. We just didn't have the number quite yet. The match is no longer applicable. Since they changed the policy, they will actually construct the sidewalk if it's identified in a plan, which is why it's so important that we have this parallel conversation with the comprehensive plan, work with the MPO, work with the municipalities to identify where we want to have these linkages occur.
Do our current plans show a lot of that, or show most of that, or that needs to be added to our plans so going forward when DOT is doing a project that in most cases it'll already be contemplated and taken care of?
Right. So in the memo, I tried to point out that the basically the groundwater, the foundation level of the areas that, we can start with the former ETJ areas where you've got pieces and sections. We can look at linking those up. We can look at our transportation corridors. We've got a basic sort of plan from years ago in regards to greenways, but we got a lot of work to do in regards to sidewalks, just because that's traditionally not been a business that the county has been engaged in. And certainly no one ever anticipated the abolishment of 2 extraterritorial jurisdictions in the county as well.
The DOT is facing all these budget, challenges, to say the least. Not just related to sidewalks, all their projects, they don't have nearly enough money to do them. So there are going to be these different decisions that the MPO needs to make around some projects are just going to be delayed. Some are going to have to be changed in scope to try to get the numbers down. And that's where some of these, different things get looked at. But those are all things that we can also have an influence on through the MPO, because the MPO will have to kind of agree on what those changes would be. So that's going to be an issue we're going to have to look at. And is the other part of this too, Nate, aside from where we try to have funds to build sidewalks with the DOT or standalone projects, do the comp plan, we also, in some cases, when there's just new development going in, the developer should put in sidewalks, right? If we've done this, or if the ETJ was still in place, we'd have a lot more sidewalks because they were required to do that previously, right? So reinstating some kind of policy, not for everywhere in the county or every kind of project, but in places where sidewalks would be really valuable, we need to have some kind of process to just require them to be built at the time of new development construction.
This is correct. This is something we're allowed to do through what's called exactions, and it certainly makes sense in our more urban areas, those former ETJ areas where you want to see the linkages occur. I think we need to look at it from a 2-pronged approach. looking at rural levels of service versus urban levels of service. So certainly that is absolutely something we will be looking at as we enter the next phase of the comprehensive plan, which is our goals, objectives, and policies.
Any other questions on this item or others for now?
In answer to your question, John, I'm fine. I don't have any questions about the fees because I know you're hoping to let the staff know.
Thank you. I had just a quick question on the sidewalk for a second. I am gonna butcher the acronym, but there is a designation for a tax district that we are using, or that we were educated about as part of the special assessment district. Is that a tool that could be relevant to conversations around revenue sources for sidewalks and other forms of infrastructure?
It could be, but we would need to do some studying around that because yes. She's saying it's a petition brought forward. We would have to do some work around where that would be applicable in our community because you have to have folks sign off on it and a large percentage of the neighborhood would have to sign on it. But yes, quick answer would be yes, it's a tool that could be used. But we have to go through all the.
Right, so maybe not a full tool, but a potential tool.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, sure. Why don't we go ahead and break for lunch? It's about 1:45 Why don't we go until maybe 5 or 10 minutes after noon? And if you're still eating, we could just we'll just resume at that time and you can eat. You can keep eating. We'll take a few minutes to just have some lunch and then resume. Okay. Okay.
Oh, Terry, I had a request to make sure you speak up the mic.
We'll almost speak into the mic. All right, so next up is the FY22 year-end projections.
Yes, sir. So we're going to talk about projections. These projections are based on actuals through April 19th, and our expectations about spending and revenue generation for the remaining quarter of the year. So to recap our FY22 budget, we are looking at our amended budget as of April 19th, 2022. This includes changes made at our April 19th meeting to include the fund balance transfer to the capital projects fund. Our budget expenditures total $388.7 million. And that includes the capital fund balance transfer of $15.2 million and $360.6 million in revenues. To balance the budget, we appropriated fund balance in the amount of $12.9 million. We are projecting revenues of $371.2 million, which is $10.6 million more than we budgeted. $3 million of this excess is through property tax, much of which is registered motor vehicles and interest on property taxes. Sales tax is the major driver for additional revenue, and we project $6.1 million more than budgeted. Reminder that our sales tax receipts lag by 3 months, so this projection is based only on our receipts for the year through January. Intergovernmental revenue is coming in below by approximately $1.4 million, largely due to $2 million of public health pandemic revenue that will carry forward to fiscal year 23. Sales and services up $1 million based on ambulance revenue, while permits and fees and registered deeds and excise tax contribute $1.4 million over budget. We are at almost 103%, 102.9% projected revenue so budget. Expenditures are projected at 96% of budget at a total of $373.4 million, including the capital fund transfer. In the graph depicted here, you will see that we are projecting salaries and benefits to be underspent by $6.5 million, program support underspent by $4.5 million, operating underspent by $3.7 million, and capital outlay under by $200,000. That leads us to our projection with fund balance. We had budgeted $12.9 million in appropriate fund balance. The capital transfer makes that total $28 million. Given the projections of $371.2 million in revenues and the $373.4 million expenditures, this is $2.2 million more expenditures than revenues and results in use of fund balance. Are there any questions regarding the projections for the current fiscal year?
Say one more time, the capital fund transfer.
The capital fund transfer that you approved on the April 19th meeting was $15.2 million. Added to the 12.9 appropriate fund balance we had before, that is $28 million budget of appropriate fund balance.
So, but all lands as described here, it would be 2.2 million of fund balance actually used.
Yes.
But if you didn't do the capital fund transfer, it'd be 17 or 18 million. Is that right?
If we didn't do the 2.2 million, if we didn't do the capital fund transfer, there would be $13 million more revenue than expenditures.
So instead of a $2.2 million fund balance use, it would be a surplus in essence of around
13 million.
Around 13 million.
I do want to make sure you understand that this is a projection through June 30, and sales tax is coming in really well. So sales tax right now, we only have through January. So the rest of the 6 months could bring this, and we would not use fund balance, or we could. So this is just projection, and we'd only have 6 months of sales tax at this point in time.
Just to follow up on Ronnie's question, so I understand we appropriated 12.9 million of fund balance to balance the budget, thinking we need to spend it, but based on what we're seeing, we would only need to spend 2.2 million.
Yes.
So there's 10.7 million of fund balance that we had designated for use this year that it looks like we will not use.
Yes.
This is sort of a crystal ball type of question, so feel free to not answer if you don't want to, but just based on how much obviously the sales tax has been much more favorable than we forecasted, which is great. We only have it through January, but just based on the fact that through January it's so favorable, if you had to answer right now, and I said, when we get the last 6 months in, this financial picture is likely to look better, right? I mean, is that kind of a fair way to think about where this is going? Because we don't have the revenue in, but we still see, here we are in April, we see the economy is still humming along in Asheville. Is it going to, do you predict it'll continue to look even better as we get a full year in?
So in numbers that we have, that we gave of revenues, we already estimated what that will look like through June 30.
Built into these
So those
forecasts.
are built into these forecasts. But we are always conservative because we don't know what will happen. So it could be better, but our anticipation is built into these numbers right now.
This projection is saying 15% above what last year's receipts were. Well,
So I don't want to jump ahead and
And
make
I
that.
just wanted to ask,
Go ahead,
I just
Parker.
wanted to ask real fast. Sorry, I didn't hear the answer to Jasmine's question. Is it true that we expected to spend $10 million more in fund balance and haven't?
You're not under oath. I don't recall.
So simple math is yes, because we had a projection of 12 to use and we're only using 2. So yes, Parker. Say your question again, Parker. I'm sorry. I thought Jasmine.
I was more so looking for the answer to Jasmine's question regarding the $10 million. I didn't hear an answer to that question.
Well, we have 10 to spend.
Well, we have.
So let's get back to that when we get to fund balance, because there is available fund balance and it'd be above the 15%, but it's below the 20. So that gap that we give, that cushion that's the part of that cushion that we give ourselves.
So if we can visually imagine one more line on the slide that says appropriated fund balance that is not going to be used, it would be about 10.7 million. Just as
It's different. So let's get to that. Can you hold that question and we get to the fund balance slides?
Okay.
Sam is going to talk us through fund balance, and he's going to work with these numbers in a way that we'll be able to see it year over year. And ideally, if you have questions after Sam's presentation, then we can talk through it a little more. I do these projections to set the stage for what our fiscal year 23 budget looks like.
Okay.
So if there are no additional questions, we're going to discuss revenue for fiscal year 23. In our second pass budget, you see property tax as usual, largest revenue source here at $240.3 million budget. This is 2.4% growth over last year. We're budgeting sales tax at $47.8 million in revenue. As we finish fiscal year 22 and move into fiscal year 23, we now see a trend where sales tax passes intergovernmental revenue as our second largest revenue stream. Intergovernmental revenue is budgeted at $45.5 million. Sales and services at $17.8 million. Transfers are budgeted at $12.5 million. Other taxes and licenses are budgeted at $10.9 million, much of which is register of deeds excise tax. Permits and fees are budgeted at $5.2 million, while other revenues are budgeted at $2.2 million. This is a total of $382.2 million in revenues. Comparing our fiscal year 23 revenue to the fiscal year 22 amended budget, we see the largest increase in revenue is sales tax, driving over half of the additional revenue we are budgeting. Property tax sees an increase due to natural growth of $6.7 million. Intergovernmental revenue sees a reduction in $3.6 million, but approximately $2.5 million of this will be carried forward in fiscal year 23. Sales and service see a decrease in $1.3 million. I'll be discussing the drivers of these revenue streams on the next slide. Transfers are increased by $7.5 million due to debt proceeds, a transfer from the capital fund for vehicles, and a transfer from the medical insurance fund. We see approximately $400,000 in additional permits and fees revenue, and an increase of $600,000 in other revenues, largely driven by higher expected investment earnings due to rising interest rates. Overall, this is a 6% increase in revenue. To dig into some of the drivers impacting our revenue changes, here you will see a list of cost centers in which there's an increase or decrease of $50,000 or more in revenue. Our largest increased revenue in departments is ambulance revenue, budgeted in line with what we saw in receipts in fiscal year 22, increasing that revenue budget by almost $1.8 million. 911 operations will see an additional $976,000 in revenue due to fiscal year 23 being the first full year of consolidation with municipalities. We see other increases due to increasing volume in permits, register of deeds, parking revenue, and planning. On the other end, the sheriff and detention center are budgeted $3.6 million less revenue due to losses of housing inmates, reduced civil process fees, and expiring school resource officer revenue from the schools. The schools are seeking grant funding for school resource officers, but that timeline is too early to know if we'll have that funding to us.
Can it be used for existing positions or only for new positions?
It can be used for existing positions. Additionally, Health and Human Services will see less revenue due to some one-time ARPA funding from last year and a reduction in COVID vaccine revenues totaling $2.1 million. All told, these changes make for a reduction of $1.88 million in revenue.
Commissioners, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, the grant that school is seeking for school resource officers. We don't know if we'll have that yet, but we did program that will continue school resource officers. So if that money comes in, it will reduce our reliance on fund balance.
Sales tax.
I'm sorry.
We're calling that sales
Parker,
tax.
did you have a question?
Yeah, sorry, and I can't see ahead on the slides, but I was looking for information on, I guess, rental car tax revenue, and then also just, vehicle property tax revenue as well, whether that's up or down or.
The vehicle property tax is included in the property tax, so it's a subset of the property tax. Registered motor vehicle tax is responsible for increases over budget in FY 2022. And so we expect that we have budgeted our registered motor vehicle tax in fiscal year 2023 based on the information provided by our tax collector on values.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes, and then what about rental car tax revenue?
So the rental car tax revenue is budgeted, is in our general tax revenues. It has been up this year. So I don't have it in front of me, but we did budget it based on a projection of this year. And with general revenues, we look at our projections for prior year and adjust those budgets accordingly where we see the revenue coming in.
We can get you the exact details on that if you like, but it's incorporated into other revenues already.
Yeah, I'd love to see those numbers. Be great. Thank you.
The rental car revenue, that's a revenue source that's prescribed by state law, and there's no ability to modify it.
Back to sales tax revenue. We're calling that this revenue lags by 3 months. This is the most difficult revenue stream to budget. You'll see that we received $37.1 million in fiscal year 21. We budgeted fiscal year 22, and we're into the first quarter of the year before we saw these totals. We discussed earlier the projection for fiscal year 22, which you see here at $42.7 million. We are budgeting fiscal year 23 sales tax at 10% above that projection. Article 46 tax is presented for your reference, and this tax funds operating capital projects for Detention.
The actuals that are shown there, 17, 11.4, and 8.6, that's the actual amount that comes to the county, not the actual amount of the total sales tax.
This is the 39, 40, and 42 are what comes to the county in general.
So like since the 39 is 50%, then obviously that's easy math. So it's the total amount's 34 million.
Yes.
Overall. And is it the same for each of those? Are each of those 34 million based on? No, they're not. They're not. No, they're generating different amounts, right? They're different.
In your handout, we put a slide on the different sales tax. One is a penny, one is a quarter cent. So they generate different amounts for the locations.
Ad valorem tax revenue. Our property tax revenue is based on the tax rate per $100 of total property value and multiplied by the collection rate. By statute, we cannot budget a collection rate that exceeds the actual rate of the year prior. While we budgeted 99.5% of collections in fiscal year 22, it looks like we will collect slightly above 99.65%. And that is the rate at which we are budgeting our ad val revenue for fiscal year 23. We will continue to assess this rate prior to adoption. Also included in that budgeted revenue amount is interest on late payments and prior year collections. Are there any questions about fiscal year 23 second pass revenue budget? And Parker, to your question here, you can see the motor vehicle property values.
Thank you.
We'll now discuss our second pass expenditures. Since the last time we met, we reviewed the list of recommended positions, cut 10 positions, as well as staggered some start dates of new positions to begin in October or January, which saved $2.02 million. We have added expected costs to implement the compensation study for the full year of fiscal year 23 at $4.97 million. We have reduced the salary budget to account for lapsed salary, as we know will not be 100% staffed. This was $4.5 million. We reduced contingency by $500,000. We looked at requested operating department budgets and reduced those budgets by $1.09 million. Additionally, there was a discontinuation of some DSS programs in fiscal year 23, saving another $220,000. We also evaluated economic development incentives and found that fund transfers could be reduced by $1 million. So this is $4.38 million of reduced expenditures since the last time.
And just to be clear, the compensation study, that is the adjustment that will be made for staff based on that compensation study. So this is all the wages.
And the benefits, associated payroll taxes and everything associated with it. Yes, but that's all in cost.
Okay, great, thank you.
What is the rationale behind decreasing 71 to 61 positions?
As you'll see, when we get to revenues over against expenditures, we didn't believe that we could afford all the positions in this year's budget. This brings us to the total of budget expenditures for the fiscal year 23 second pass budget. Our expenditures total $393.9 million, with salaries and benefits at $170.8 million. Program support is budgeted at $129.8 million. Operating expenditures are budgeted at $58.9 million. Debt service is budgeted at $19.1 million. Transfers and other financing are budgeted at $10.3 million. Capital outlay is budgeted at $4.6 million, and we have budget contingency at $500,000. So looking at the comparison with the fiscal year 22 amended budget, the increase in the salary and benefits is $14.6 million to accommodate the compensation study, new positions, COLA, and increased state retirement costs. Program support increases by $2.5 million. Operating is kept relatively flat with an increase of less than $30,000 while still funding department expansions. Debt service is budgeted $1.3 million less than fiscal year 22 based on current obligations. Transfers are budgeted at $2.5 million more than last year, with the increase here for us to transfer economic development incentive payments to the multi-year special projects. Capital outlay is $1.9 million more due to an increase in requested vehicles. Contingency shows here as an increase, but was originally budgeted at $1 million in the fiscal year 22 adopted budget, with $700,000 having been used for needs. Any questions about the expenditure budget as presented? Therefore, with $382,225,087 in expected revenues and $393,924,033 in budgeted expenditures, we will need to appropriate fund balance of approximately $11,698,946 to balance the budget. Are there any questions? Sam Riddle is going to lead us through a discussion of fund balance.
Commissioners, good to be with you again. Last week, there was some discussion about fund balance. So we thought to provide a review for you as well as help the average taxpayer understand fund balance. We would walk through a few things today. Make no mistake about it, fund balance can be very complicated. So we tried to distill this down a little bit with some example scenarios that will set the stage for us to talk about the real numbers. So in the first scenario, the basic idea is, what if fund balance stays exactly the same? So in our example organization, we have a fund balance of $25,000. Like us, there is a policy requirement that says 15% of your expenditures should be available in your fund balance. As a quick reminder of where that comes from, 15% represents only 2 months of expenditures. You may remember that the LGC requires, Local Government Commission requires 8%. They get that calculation 1 divided by 12, 1 month out of a year, that's 8.33%, 8%. Some organizations go as high as 25, which is 3 months of expenditures, right? So 8, 15, 25, that's equates to 1, 2, and 3 months of expenditures. So in our scenario here, we're saying expenses always equal revenues, but each year it's growing by 10%. If we project that out, notice that even while fund balance stays the same, the amount of available fund balance is decreasing each year. That's sort of the first image to stick with you. In the second scenario, scenario B, we're doing something that hits a little closer to home. What if we're contributing to fund balance each year? You see the revenue amounts on the left side of your slide or screen, and notice in some years they're larger, in some years they're smaller. And here's what that looks like. You can see that the bar as a whole is growing each year. The 15% portion is growing as well. What is not so easy to see by looking at this is that year 1 and year 4 available fund balance stays the same. It's actually at $12,000 in each year, despite contributing $7,000 over that 4-year period. So theoretically, even with contributions, it could be a little bit below compared to prior years, or a little bit above, or even the same. So obviously we've simplified that to prepare those images for you. In reality, like I said before, it is a little more complicated. To open the financial statements is to find roughly at least 9 types of fund balance, beginning with total fund balance, which is everything. Of course, not all of that is available. There's restricted and unrestricted. This is where we're going to concentrate today, on that unrestricted amount, and that's what we were looking at in those example scenarios. It should be noted as well that when we talk about 15%, it needs to be unrestricted, right? So there are a few restricted types. We're not going to talk about those today. We're going to briefly talk about our unrestricted types, beginning with committed. We've already talked about this a little bit. That's that transfer to capital. More broadly, committed fund balance is under the board's authority, designating to a specific expenditure or expenditure type. So in this case, like a capital transfer, there's a policy that guides that. There's assigned fund balance. That's what is used to balance the next year's budget. And of course, there's unassigned, which is everything else, the remaining amount. So let's look at previous years, real dollars, and then using the information that you've seen today from John's projection and FY23 information and appropriation, we'll look at a 22 projection of fund balance. So we have total fund balance. Remember, that's the big number. Not all of that is available. We have the unrestricted amount here. So let's take a look at what makes up that 72, 72 and a half, 75.8. We have the 15% amount, roughly 46 million in FY19. And above that, we had 25.5 million in available fund balance. That is, everything above 15% is considered available. In FY20, the available fund balance comes down slightly to 24 million, though overall it is a slight growth. In 21, we're up slightly to 26 million, above the 15% mark. And if you were to reconcile that to financial statements, you would say, Sam, that's not right. Unrestricted was actually 91 million at the end of 21. And you're right, because I am excluding the amount that we just transferred last week. Since it's gone to a specific expenditure, it's no longer showing on our graph here. So, in other words, 15.2 sent out brings us down to our 20%, including or plus the appropriation to balance 22's budget. And finally, a projection of 22. Based on the information that John has provided, we would be up to 30.4 million in available fund balance. That is above that 15% mark. But there's a second piece here. Because of that same policy, we're projecting a 2.4 transfer to the capital fund. So in total, there would be 32.8 million above the 15%. So the question, of course, is what do we do with that information? Well, I think the main takeaways here are right now, today, this stage, we're projecting a $2.4 million transfer to capital. That projection is contingent upon the total expenditure projection that you've seen today and the appropriated fund balance for FY23 that you've seen today, both of which are under your discretion to change.
Go back one slide.
Absolutely.
So from that, so the last chart, so you're forecasting the the revenues would come in above our policy, therefore triggering the $2.4 million transfer to the capital fund.
Correct.
But you also are forecasting that we're going to need to appropriate, what was the amount of balance?
11.7 to balance 23.
I guess in a way, my question is like, why don't you just not appropriate that much fund balance and not do the $2.4 million transfer? Like, for example, just take the $2.4 million out of what's the forecasted use of fund balance, and then you wouldn't be planning to have the 2.4 million spill over to the capital fund.
So the 2.4 million would be excess via your policy. So it would need to be transferred per policy unless the policy were to be changed. Now, this is a projection. And as you saw this year, we have to wait until our audit is complete. So it will be almost a year from now where we will know what that number is. 2.4 and $2.4 million is just a projection based on what we're seeing today.
Okay, and that makes sense. And just make sure I'm understanding this right. So even with it's $11 million of appropriate fund balance, we would still go over our policy by 2.4 million, even if we burn through 11 million of fund balance.
Right. The 11.7 is technically part of that bar, right? So again, the 2.4 is just projected, and that's still contingent. That may change. But based on that projection, we would leave roughly 30 million in remaining unassigned. So what to do with that? We can look at one-time expenditures, see potential uses of that. We could hold steady, unsure, or at least understanding of the economic uncertainty that we potentially face. Or even closer to that, we have yet to see presentations from our education partner, and those could go beyond what we have set up in our current FY23 projected budget. So with that, I hope this sets the stage for the review of the multi-year financial outlook, as well as the conversation with capital.
This is very helpful. Can we go back, I think 2 slides? Thank you. To me, I know that we're looking ahead to 2023. To me, a piece that I just want to make sure we're carrying through the various conversations we're having is the 2022 numbers. You know, I think our tendency sort of at the commission level has sort of been at the end of each year, we sort of say, oh, okay, we thought we were going to use this much fund balance, and we didn't, and then we don't really address it in the final month of a fiscal year. So I'm just interested in sort of putting on the table, whether that's a discussion that folks are interested in having is, as we close out the current fiscal year, are there ways that we might want to consider using fund balance as a source of funding for one-time projects? Because we did come in with that $10 million, or our peers were coming in with that $10 million differential between the amount of fund balance we thought we were going to need to use and the amount that we are actually using to balance this year's budget. But I would want to, of course, hear your perspective and then just.
So let us walk through the financial outlook, because you're right. We have to look at what finishes one year and takes it into the other. So what we've been doing the last since I've been here actually is thinking about financial outlook and looking beyond the 1 year and not having to talk about a tax increase every year. So we do have the next section is talking about that 2-year outlook, 2 to 3 year outlook. And as you will see, we start to dip into that 15%, but we would have to really think through the projections, the assumptions that we're making. I want to make sure that we don't come back off cycle to talk about tax increases. So I don't want to think about spending it too early because we have to program it into future years as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of the great debate, especially in a time of such economic uncertainty, is we want to be prudent and have that multi-year forecasting. And yet we also want to be responsive, I think, to a lot of the things happening on the ground in people's lives in Buncombe County right now, as we come out of this period. And I just, to me, I don't go into this with a foregone conclusion, but I do feel like we have responsibility to really kind of dig into the question about whether, I mean, we're more than meeting the threshold of our policy requirements. So there's no concern about us coming in prior to your administration or years past. I think there were concerns about, are we dipping below that? Are we using that as this as a tool to avoid a tax increase, et cetera? The numbers here suggest that we are in a very strong position relative to our policy of 15%. And I do just think we ought to at least have the conversation about, we just got an incredibly high level of requests for rescue plan funding, which we don't have the funds to address, but speak to many compelling needs in the community. That included requests from other municipalities and from within Buncombe County government. And I just want to make sure we're doing our due diligence to think about the highest, best use of fund balance dollars that exceed the policy requirement we've set. We've now done the capital transfer, so we've kind of met those requirements. And that's the question that I guess I'm just sort of persisting on, that I don't feel like we've had a chance to really look under the hood on and say, is this a source that we could consider as a responsible way to fund certain types of projects where there's a demonstrated real immediate need?
So I understand that. Give me a second, John. So you're right that we have the ability to have that conversation, but I want to make sure that we're clear. The 15% is our floor. It is 2 months of operations to run a $400 million corporation, so to speak. And 20% is our high. And really 1 month is 8.3%. So we're even not 2% because 2% is 16.6%. So going to 20 is really 2.5 months of operations. So yes, we can have that conversation, but I don't want us to lose that thought that our floor is only 2 months and our high is only 2.5 months. So I just want to make sure you put that on the table.
Right, and I'm not suggesting anything that's not prudent in the end. I'm just suggesting that we do our due diligence on looking at options, and the decision might be the most responsible thing is to not do anything with this. But I just, my request, if other commissioners are up for it, is that at some point in the 6 weeks ahead, we have that conversation.
So I do want to reiterate Sam's point about our education partners. When they came to us regarding an increase a couple months ago in salaries, they did note that they had put a lot of their salary increases using one-time ARPA funding this year in order to not bring us such an increase when we did the budget for them a couple months ago. So while we have projected, we've given them the unrestricted revenue growth rate of 6.22%, it's extremely possible we may see a request above and beyond that, which would increase the appropriate fund balance to house this budget.
I also want to be sure, as we particularly talk about our schools, I know that a lot of questions have been asked about our two school districts, about how often they're using fund balance, their budget, and how far are they dipping into it. And I want us to be really cognizant that we're really zeroing in on them for doing that. And it doesn't appear to be in a positive way that we're asking those questions, that we're not talking out of both sides of our mouth, and we're saying, oh, but we're going to really dig into our own fund balance, but schools, we don't want you to. So I just want to elevate that as part of this conversation as well, that I don't want us to be disingenuous in our questioning of our schools if we're going to look at doing something similar to what they've had to do.
You know, I don't want us to be constantly in the mode of like, let's reassess our policies, because I know that's all takes a lot of work and stuff. You know, I will say, and this has been several years ago, before Avril came on board. We did, for those who were on the board back then, you might recall, we kind of had some discussions around, like we were talking about similar situation, right? We're in a budget, we're talking about fund balance. And I think we asked staff to kind of help us understand how different counties around the state think about fund balance, and like, what is their fund balance? You know, because we just have our experience here, right? And it seems like, yeah, we're doing great. And, but when we look at a lot of the other similar sized counties in the state, as I recall, like my general takeaway is that they actually had much larger fund balances, like by surprising orders of magnitude. And you know, and we were kind of asking, like, well, why do they, and especially for some of the bigger counties where you know, the numbers are even so much larger because their budgets are so much bigger. You know, I mean, in a way, my takeaway from it was I was kind of proud of us, right? Because I feel like we were being a bit more like, you know, we're not just stashing away hundreds of millions of dollars. We're using it, trying to kind of, you know, keep it, you know, working for the community. But I will say, I also did just wonder, I mean, these are all smart organizations, right? Like, I just wondered why they were felt like carrying such a larger fund balance was, you know, the right thing to do. I mean, when I hear Avril say, remember, this is the difference between like 2 and 3 months, you know, it does, like, you know, make me think, well, you know, maybe we are keeping it too tight here. Maybe we need to, I mean, I feel like the economy is going very well here and things like that, but, you know, we do live in a world of uncertainty, and I don't know. I mean, are we in the, I'm not asking you to reevaluate this right now, but I would just say for myself, I've never quite understood why so many other counties seem to have such a different policy approach than we do when it comes to what is the right amount to carry in the fund balance, and is scooping off stuff over 30% to capital. See some benefits of that for sure, but maybe, you know, maybe we should be open to doing more. And also, while at the same time hearing, like, yeah, I mean, Amanda, I agree with you. We kind of push others on stuff too, so I don't want us to not also push ourselves. But those are all just questions I've always found like this to be kind of one of the harder things to, I don't know, kind of have a sense for what's the right place to land on it over a long period of time. And I still find myself there. So
We actually did this fund balance policy in 2020 or 2020.
Yeah.
We did this fund balance and give you a range to make sure that we had more flexibility than a minimum 15%. So we did that range then, and we crafted the money going into capital because we have a capital improvement plan that is not funded. So this was a way to start funding that capital improvement. And if we're going to invest in the facilities that we have in Buncombe County, we need to start funding that capital. So that was the rationale behind that time. And we were really trying to walk that tightrope of not having too much taxpayer dollars sitting in the accounts and walking for that balance. But you're exactly right. Our counties our size and larger have a much different, larger fund balance, because 2 months is really a short timeline that you have to meet all your obligations, whether it's debt service or salaries or accounts payable with vendors. You want to make sure you have that. So we can take a look to see if we should expand those numbers again. But for me, 15% is low. So that's why I want to make sure I reiterated that 15 to 20 is really the spot that we wanted to be in.
And I'll just say, for me, I do believe 15% is low. I certainly believe in a strong fund balance. And so I think that that's just really prudent for us to at least maintain that and really consider. So I feel good with the way the policy is currently. And And can you speak some more to, because I'm supportive of in that excess going into the capital projects, because I do believe that's important. Can you speak more to that point of how that's beneficial for us?
And we are going to get to a use of like how we're going to use those capital funds on capital in a little bit. And we're also going to have a discussion around capital funding.
And I was just speaking in general as why this is important that we have it set up in this way.
Right, and we have a 5-year capital plan, actually longer than that, but we bring every 5 years to you. And we don't currently have a funding mechanism to fund some of those projects. So what we were looking at with this top over 20% going to capital, it was around, we can choose, and this is a conversation I think Jasmine wants to get into, is looking at Paygo versus debt service. But that money can be paid for debt service. So if we have buildings, and we know we have deferred maintenance ourselves on buildings, our own buildings, whether they're community centers we own that we've abandoned or parks that we need to work on, there are several assets we have that we have not maintained to the best of our ability. So the idea around the capital projects fund and funding that, we can then choose to use some of that money for debt service so we can get some of our big buildings taken care of, or we can use Paygo to keep the interest rates down. So that was the thought behind starting to build a capital project fund and not just have a list of projects that need work that don't have any funding source behind it.
Thank you.
I guess, Avril, I guess my question or comment would be, to Jasmine's point, I'm very sympathetic to her argument and idea there, understanding that we might not do anything and understanding that the schools are about to come to us with large requests. I guess when is the best time to have this discussion about the fund balance? Is it, is it in the summer, in the middle of the summertime, or when's the best time to talk about this?
I think we can do that right after the audit is done and we have the final numbers. I know it's late because the number's already done, but the board can choose at that point to commit the money to capital projects or by resolution spend some of that money. So it will be after the year, right? And all the numbers are in and we have our audit before we get into budget and have two separate conversations. One, the audited numbers are here. Here's what the number is that's going to go to capital. And at that point, we can make some decisions on capital spending at that time. That'll be my recommendation.
Okay. Thank you.
We're ready to move forward. Yep. This brings us to our two-year outlook. So for our outlook, we've made some assumptions. On the revenue side, our tax rate will remain at 48.8%, 2.4% national annual growth in property tax. We have $47.8 million in fiscal year 23 sales tax revenue. And other revenues growing by between 1 to 3% based on their source. On the expenditure side, calculated 3% annual growth in education, a 1% annual growth in operating and program support budgets, a 6% growth in personnel in fiscal year 24. This is likely due to what we'll see in a COLA based on inflation now, and a 2.5% increase in fiscal year 25, as well as increases in investments and strategic plan priorities. Our target is to finish above the minimum 15% fund balance ending fiscal year 24. So with this financial outlook, with those assumptions in mind, and adding numbers from our fiscal year 22 projections, fiscal year 23 second pass, we see a 16.5% fund balance remaining fiscal year 2024, which meets our target. Fund balance does dip below 15% in fiscal year 25, which will require future evaluation of revenues and expenditures as we get closer to that. Are there any questions about this outlook?
Go back one slide. On the sales tax revenue, you've got 1 year growth rate at 10% increase. What does it assume after the first year?
I'll need to go back and check. You know, North Carolina Department of Revenue is saying that they expect only a 3.5% increase in the coming years over prior years for sales tax.
So that seems actually like a pretty optimistic number there. So I'm glad to hear you're optimistic. But that's just for the first year. It's not assuming 10% annually.
No, 10% of the first year. I'll need to check, and I believe we've dialed it down to 3% the following year.
Alternatively, sir, the 3% on education growth, we haven't really done that.
That's also optimistic.
Sure.
For us.
So these are the assumptions we're making for this particular scenario. Things could be different. We could plug different numbers in here. We could plug less revenue or more expenditures.
So okay, let's stay on this slide for a minute. So I appreciate the multi-year forecast. Obviously, this is really all really high level, right? I mean, let me just ask it this way. I have seen this presentation before, right? Like, I feel like every time we kind of ask these multi-year forecasts, they show the same trend, right? But again, like I've sat through a lot of these budgets, like every year it's like $10, $12 million unallocated fund balance. That's what we're going to use. And I don't think it's ever happened, right? So I guess I just, and I realize county organizations should be conservative in the way they do budget forecasting. I mean, I agree. But when we start applying those principles to this, then I also just kind of start feeling like, you know what, it's going to be, barring some really unexpected thing in the world, which we've seen some of this happen lately, but the most likely scenario is that it'll be quite a bit better than this. So I guess I just want to ask, like, from a policy making standpoint, I'm not saying you're not doing it right, but on the other hand, there's this kind of experience of things being, in all likelihood,
so I think
we're not going to use as much fund balance.
I think it's important to think about our revenues this year with almost $7 million additional sales tax that we really projected. And without that revenue stream being quite so high and greater than it has been in 20 years, that would be an additional almost $7 million of fund balance we would appropriate this year on top of the 2.2. So revenues came in very high and put us in a position this year that we didn't really truly expect. And that's when we were here a year ago, we were barely above. We did have more revenue than we projected, but that number was 100.3%. Today it's 102.9%. So these revenues are much higher than we could have anticipated. And that sales tax stream, I just want to say how hard it is and difficult it is to project that stream, especially since we we will not see these fiscal year 22 actuals until we're in October of this year. So,
and Commissioner, I will say the last 2 years, the money from the state and feds is what really saved us as well, because sales tax did not perform as 20 first year of the pandemic, but the state kicked in and the CARES money and all the other monies came, and that's what helped us. So there have been things that has happened along the way the past 2 years. The other thing that helps us, or I don't know if this is a help, but we haven't filled all positions all year. We've had turnover this year, and we haven't spent the salaries that we would normally have spent before either. So not spending the expenditures, and then sales tax is really the one that came in high, were the two things that has helped. This year in our budget, we anticipate not budgeting 100% of salaries. We anticipate that there will be turnover, or not turnover, we can't fill the positions because the staff and it's not there. So we don't have 100% baked in. So we're hoping not to leave that expense on the table. And the other thing you would notice is operations was kept flat. So we didn't put any growth, because if the staff isn't here to work, all that work is not being spent, travel is not happening. So we have really dialed back on our operations as well as our salaries. So we have put some policies administratively in the budget to try to fix the issue that you're saying. Every year we're adding tens of thousands of millions of dollars back to the fund balance.
Questions?
The other thing I'll say beyond this slide is 2026, which will be a reval year. So we're hoping to keep that sales tax until that reval. So we didn't put next year on there because the idea then was to have that whole revaluation conversation of revenue neutral. What does that look like in 2026?
Chairman Newman, the sales tax assumption for the fiscal year 25 is 4%.
So 10 and then 4.
Yes.
And thanks for pointing out the property tax rate that you were maintaining that. I think that's really important for folks to realize as well.
Working on it.
All right, what's next?
Okay, so John had to step away, but Matt Evans is here eventually to talk us through capital projects and debt in advance of our specific capital project.
Afternoon, Chairman.
Yeah.
Commissioners, how are y'all? Sorry, I'm not Don, but we have some debt for dessert. So, let's mess this up. So we want to talk through different aspects of kind of capital, like maybe some like Capital 101, right? And then I'll walk us through some different principles that are found in our debt policy, and then kind of how those things are shaken out. So, capital project versus capital asset. If I was to ask you right now what the difference between that was, do you think you could faithfully answer that?
Yeah.
Well, Avril could. Avril will probably correct me a couple of times with the CPA that she is. But so generally the capital projects are those things that you see on the CIP. You know, it comes to the budget process. We see as CIP projects in the School Capital Fund Commission and the AV Tech stuff. Those are typically large cost projects. Example, courtroom repair or a 200 college exterior repair. A capital asset, however, is an accounting mechanism, essentially. You know, we set thresholds, we capitalize something on the books. Those are things like land, buildings, vehicles, machinery. Intangibles are things like copyrights, software. And then it's good to note that capital project may result in a capital asset, but not always. Example, if you walk on the 4th floor, perhaps they're putting down carpet on the ground. That may not be a capital asset, right? So we typically, I think our threshold for most things is $25,000 when we're dealing with the capital asset piece, not the capital project piece. And then of course, land and vehicles, I believe we do capitalize those just in general. So then our debt policy. So when we think through this, we typically issue debt for bigger, larger items, right? Like buildings, vehicles. We don't do it for salaries. It's not a thing. And then we think about the timing, right? So we usually do long-term debt for things. Vehicles are typically 5 years, right? We're thinking about useful life. And sometimes it does go beyond the life. For example, 20 to 30 years, you know, if we're doing something on our current debt list, maybe the solar installation that may last 20, may not. Anyway, so pretty general there. So here's a fun conversation, right? What do we do with debt versus Paygo? And this comes on the heels of the conversation you just had about how we transferred over a large portion of money to pay for some things that we had on prior year CIPs. So in general, we try to only go out for debt when it's absolutely necessary. Things that make it necessary. So we think about the timing of something, how long it lasts. We think about favorable interest rates. And I use quotes over favorable interest rates because what is a favorable interest rate? We're seeing right now that interest rates are rising, right? And then we try to always make sure that our credit rating, which is something that these outside agencies come in and they go, hey, you guys are this good. And potential investors will say, I feel good about buying a bond from Buncombe County because they have currently 2 AAA ratings, Moody's and Standard & Poor's. So thinking about more debt stuff and more Paygo. And the debt would be quicker delivery of projects. You know, we spread the cost, we amortize, we spread the cost over a certain amount of years, typically 20 years for the traditional capital projects as we think about them as like buildings, 5 for vehicles. It does create capacity. We see that capacity creation maybe more so on the School Capital Fund Commission side because we're leveraging a dedicated funding source coming in that is perhaps $19 million a year. You know, we could go and spend money on 3 projects, or we could issue debt and smooth it out over time. As we talk through the next few slides, though, remember that we're talking about Buncombe County and not the School Capital Fund Commission, who has its own dedicated fund, and AV Tech. So Paygo considerations. How much money do we have on hand? We happen to have $15 million, which happened to take a big fell swoop out of some stuff that we had on CIP that we could have issued debt for. Timing of projects, when can they feasibly be done? And of course, interest savings we can use for, you know, think about like we go for now, for example, now I'm working through a debt application for our current debt issuance where we may have some refinancing in there. We try to treat our debt as if you would treat your debt at home, where if you had a better interest rate come up, we're always trying to be good stewards of that and get better interest rates. So those savings can be put towards other items. I feel like I'm going pretty fast at this, so y'all stop me. So what this slide hopes to achieve is an accountability aspect. So in our debt policy, we have certain restrictions on how much debt we will have. There is a note at the top of your sheet, if you have this slide, that basically says per statute, 8% of appraised value of property versus debt, et cetera, et cetera. We restrict that even further. That is that top row there, which is the net direct debt as a percentage of our assessed valuation, what's on the rolls there. We keep it at less than 3%. So the numbers in the right column, you can see that we're at 0.98%, so we're doing pretty good there. That one's usually always good because, as you know, values typically go up, and the nature of debt is to typically go down unless we keep adding on to it. So there's kind of a converse relationship there. And then one that's super important is that second row, the net direct debt as a percentage of total governmental fund expenditures. That's one that we want to keep our eyes on. We currently have it not to exceed 18%. And don't get these confused with the fund balance policies of 15%. These are different ratios. 18%, we are currently at the end of 2021, 12.5%. So we're doing good there. And then the payout of net direct debt principal, that basically looks to see how we're smoothing those costs over time. We strive for a ratio of 65%, but we will maintain a 55% or better. And so if we're shooting for a 65, we're currently at 76.14, which is a good thing. And then, of course, outstanding variable rate debt as a percentage of net direct debt. Variable rate debt, of course, would be rate that the rates kind of, you know, shift up and down. We don't like that, so we don't have anything there. So it's 0. And here is just kind of over time. It's probably not too clear on the screens, but I hope you have it in front of you. You can basically see as you walk through those different accountability measures that were here, that we are doing pretty good. You know, we've done really well over this is since 2017. The folks on the 4th floor, we try to keep a good eye on this. So, and this, of course, is Buncombe County related debt, not, yeah. So I think that's it. Any questions?
You did it. Sorry. You did a good job with this. Can you slow down a little bit on, or maybe just, I'm sorry, review and maybe go a little bit slower on when we do debt versus Paygo?
Absolutely.
And great.
Maybe. So let's start here. So basically, things we want to consider. How much does something cost? What is the bigger picture of all the things that have to cost a certain amount to get done in a particular CIP year? Typically, we'll look and see what we have left to transfer over. If there's some room, we'll try to make it happen. If not, but typically these are the larger items, right? Like the items that we're putting on the current debt issuance are, and that was a special year, obviously, but the solar projects, very expensive. The fleet building, I think, is over it's like over $6 million. Yeah. So money. How long will it last? You know, if it's something that's going to be consumed in the next 2 years, it's probably not a good candidate for debt. Interest rates, you know, we look and see if interest rates are good. Right now, we're seeing that interest rates are going up. So now would probably might have been a good time to use Paygo if we had money in the bank.
And do we think about also the kind of cumulative impact? Like we want to have X number of projects being debt financed at any given time. Does that become a factor at all, or is that less relevant?
Not the number of projects, but to his point, if you go to the ratios, those kind of guide our monies. The 18% figure there is how much cash you really have to pay for these. We want to keep that on the 18%. So he said that second bullet is really operational in nature. So we try to make sure the funds that we allocate to debt doesn't consume too much of your cash that you have to spend. So those ratios are really the guiding principles of how we look between debt or cash. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So the so we could use it. We could use debt more, right? I mean, that's part of the takeaway here. Is like we choose to use Paygo for some different projects, for maybe a pretty meaningful number of projects that debt could be used for, but for the reasons you outlined, right? Like you don't make interest payments, for these various reasons. I guess just like part of my sort of takeaway on this is like if there were things that we really wanted to do, like if our fund balance was really tight, by pushing, instead of just paying for things all at once, financing them, right? Like that really frees up a lot of space in your budget. I mean, right now, like we've been in a pretty good financial position. Like, again, we're ending our years and better than we thought we would be, not worse. So I feel like there's not necessarily a lot of pressure on us to change the approach, but also just looking at it, like if there's a lot of capacity there if we did want to use it. And, as a AAA, as a group with a really high, the best possible credit rating, interest rates have crept up, but we're still, relative to like everybody else in the world, able to access really, really low cost capital through these kind of vehicles, right? So it's a tool that's in the toolbox that we use, and we could use more if we found in our situation where it's like, hey, we don't, doing so much through Paygo is not as attractive because maybe we have other choices we wanted to make.
And I will add to that. So this year was an outlier, right? So you did do a lot of Paygo this year, and we're not afraid of debt as an organization. We typically do more, we do a lot more debt maybe than we do Paygo. So I think it flipped a little this year. And what we do kind of under the hood upstairs is we look and see what we currently had on the books that we didn't issue debt for, which was all those things you guys paid for a couple meetings ago. And then we look and see what kind of is on that CIP upcoming, and we really start to think, okay, looking at John's 5-year plan, what are we rocking? And then we go from there. So you're absolutely right. Great rating. We manage our debt well. It's there if we need it, which we typically do use it. So
I think every year since I've been here, we've issued debt, but it hasn't been geo debt that you have a bond referendum for. It is actually going to the bank and borrowing. We borrowed money to vehicles the first year we started the sheriff program, because we had issued or bought vehicles in such a long time that was the first year I think we did vehicles. So we tend to look to see what's on the plan, what are we doing, and then we would bring it forward in the budget conversation.
All right, other questions? Any questions from?
Recapping our debt policy and referring to our CIP document. This is the guidance we've used about funding debt versus Paygo. So finance office supports funding smaller capital expenditures, less than $500,000, where they have a shorter useful life, less than 10 years. Via Paygo, while debt financing larger expenditures and those that have longer useful life. So this guidance prevails for most decisions when we're looking at Paygo versus debt. So as we move forward to our list of recommended capital projects for fiscal year 23. As Don discussed last week, we were considering projects in which we would normally use Paygo for capital fund transfer dollars. These are the EVs charging infrastructure, library renovation and repair, public safety training center generator, the recreation services master plan, and our vehicles for a total of $5,218,815. We would consider going out to debt on the EMS-based construction, facility assessment, renovation and repair, and solar on schools. We cannot issue debt on projects until we actually have projects bid out and the work is started. So all projects that are slated for a particular fiscal year and debt may not actually go out for debt in the same year. Are there any questions or thoughts about the funding of these projects for fiscal year 20? Due to the capital fund transfer, we will not actually do any Paygo this year. We'll use the funds that we transfer to the capital. That makes sense? So our next.
It's not in this packet, of course, but there is a multi-year capital project.
That was in your packet last time. So.
The three that help.
And just remind me the facility assessment, renovation, and repair. What's that one on? You may have just said it.
That we're gonna look at debt financing that one. That's several projects combined. That's the first year of projects that they've identified through the comprehensive facility assessment. I believe there's parking lot work done at one of the libraries, and there's also elevator work in this building, and I don't have Ronnie here next to me at this moment to remember exactly what the other two items are, but it's those items bundled together.
But it's the 4 items we saw at our December retreat,
Yes.
if I recall.
Yes.
correctly.
And we did give you some, last month, we gave you some detail on those as well. Thank you. So our next steps. On May 10th, we will host fire districts who are requesting a tax rate increase and our education partners. We have 3 fire districts who have reached out to us, and we will consider those requests first on the May 10th meeting. And we've collected the questions that you've asked of our education partners. So you have that information as in advance of this meeting. And now that you've seen our revenues and expenditures together with an estimated appropriate fund balance of $11.7 million, what questions do you have? Are you in support of these expenditures as presented? What have we missed? And what do you need from us to move forward to a recommended budget?
I guess at this point, what I'm most
Parker?
I was saying at this point, what I'm most worried or interested, curious, whatever word you want to use, about is these school requests. Have we already sent, I guess, both school systems our questions and asks of them in terms of their presentation?
Yes, I sent their responses out via email yesterday.
I think what he's asking for is Parker, are you asking about have we seen their request yet?
Yeah, I guess I'm asking 2 questions. Have we seen their requests? Is that something you could send us? And then also, have we sent school systems specific questions from our end? Have we sent that yet? Or is there still time to ask more questions of them prior to their presentation?
So we gathered a list of questions from you a couple weeks ago regarding schools, and we sent that out. They responded Friday. I emailed their responses out yesterday, and they were also included in today's packet, but you should have their responses in your emails of yesterday. So they did answer the questions that you had asked. We do not have their actual funding requests in hand yet. They also have to meet with their boards in order to formulate their budget. But those meetings are supposed to happen before they see you on May 10th.
Correct. And we are meeting as a staff. We have asked for those meetings individually with their staff, and as soon as we get data, we'll send that to you. I know that Buncombe County schools are meeting on the 7th, I believe.
May.
May. First part of May, they're needed, so they have to have their board endorsement before they can.
Okay.
Before we get that, but as soon as we've asked them if they can give us some preliminary numbers, we hope to have that by the end of the week, and then we can at least know where we're headed, recommendations from them. But we have shared with them our restricted revenue growth of 6.6%. But to John's point, they told us last year that the state is looking at going to $15 for all the non-classified. So we know that there's probably a bigger ask than the 6% it's going to cover.
All right. Commissioners, any more questions for our budget work session today?
I'll say I appreciate all the work, and I know that it's really tough cutting back on some of those personnel. And I do wonder with that, because with, as I recall, so with the opioid settlement funds, right? I think if I'm remembering correctly, last time you put in that program funding it through the general budget. And I do wonder if like that could be funded, would make sense through those opioid settlement funds. And I believe also we're funding port, I believe, through our general budget. And if we were able to look at funding those through those opioid settlement funds.
We can put that as a request. At the last meeting, the opioid group came forward and said they're going to work with their community, work with their existing programs, and bring a financial plan to you to endorse. That plan would have those kind of ongoing operations. But if you want us to look at that earlier as part of this budget and not use general fund, that's an option that you can put on the table for us. But the intent was to have that financial plan come to the board and then you endorse that, what options you want to go with, and then that will be funded that way.
Well, I guess my question seems like we're supportive of port and that. I don't think we're not going to support that, right? So it just seems like something to me we should consider in these very challenging discussions.
I'd weigh in on the side of working the process that's been outlined, just because this is an area where the county is doing incredible work, and also many, many different community partners are as well. And you know, I think staff have developed a blueprint for a process that will engage all the right stakeholders and get us to a place where there's a lot of community support behind the decisions that are made. I personally would be reticent to supersede that process before it's had an opportunity to work. So that's where I would land.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate it. I mean, I was always like from the first pass to second pass, there's always kind of this sort of, you know, ideal, like, you know, dream big. And then there's kind of like, okay, what can we do this year? I appreciate, you know, thinking about the prioritization of the stuff that's most important. I mean, we are bringing a lot more revenue than we thought, but also we're seeing inflation that's going to eat up a lot of these revenues too. And part of it's, you know, it's going to be like we've got a policy that says we're going to try to, you know, do payroll adjustments to account for inflation. That'll hit us over a couple of different budget years, right? So that's going to take a lot of revenues. We're doing the comp plan, pay changes. That's going to be, you know, an important investment for us to make. So I think we do have to be careful about expanding the number of positions to make sure we can really like take care of all the positions that we have, right? So I'm glad we're focused on this.
You raised his hand.
Oh yeah, Parker. Or I'm sorry, was Parker raised his hand? Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
No, I'm good.
All right. Any other last questions or feedback for today? This is a really productive session. So thanks everyone for helping put together great information and analysis discussion.
You know, one thing I'd like to add, because it was interesting listening. Folks, I didn't get this gray hat just from getting old. It's come from going through good and bad times. And when I hear us talk about fund balance and all, that's great and what we need to do. But let's be careful when we look ahead, when you look at our economy, inflation, and what's going on. We need to be ready for bad times. And my concern is, you know, if we're not, that's where we can really hurt our constituents when we look at raising property taxes or have to do knee-jerk things we don't want to have to do. But I want to caution us now. We need to be careful because it's a lot going on around us now. And especially when you look nationally, what's going on. We don't know what's coming in November. We don't know financially where we'll be a year from now. You know, and it appears we've been fortunate, but I'm always afraid of this one-time money. You know,
I mean, Al, that's a good point. You know, when you hear like the General Assembly talk about some of these issues, like they have like what we call it a fund balance. They call part of like the rainy day fund. Right?
Yeah,
We don't call any part of ours a rainy day fund. In a way, that's what it is. That you build up enough there that if there is unexpected cost or economic slowdown, you can get through the slow periods in the economy too, right? Avril, any other thoughts on any of that?
Not on that topic, but my question for you guys is, was there any other expenses that we needed to include in the budget that we haven't included? Was there anything else that you all were thinking about that we missed? I know John asked, what did we miss? I want to make sure as we finalize, because the next time we sit down will be education and fire districts, and then we will talk through putting together a recommended budget on May 19th. So
Is the homeownership grant program, property tax grant program included?
That is included.
It's still included. Okay, great. Thank you.
we didn't hear any to take it out, so we left it in as well.
You know, I had to step out of the
We
meeting.
don't know yet if other municipalities will continue to partner with us.
I know I had to step out of that meeting before that conversation was concluded. I kind of debriefed with some people afterwards. I mean, it sounds like there's support for it. I will just say, you know, for myself on this, like I'm glad we're doing something and want to continue to do something. I do, you know, to me the very high administrative cost of the way it's structured now, I feel like that is something we should continue to look at, because I mean the whole idea here is we're trying to help taxpayers, right? So, but if our admin costs for a program consume such a high percentage of it, I just think it's something that we should look at. And if there are some other ways of doing it to get more of the benefit down to the taxpayers and not just kind of, you know, consume so much of our staff time and things like that. I don't have some great proposal to put on the table, so I'm not proposing something. I'm just kind of raising that as something I feel like maybe there's still maybe opportunities to make that a more efficient system.
And we agree, and we would say that first year startup, we probably wouldn't have that level again, but last year it was truly building it as we were trying to deliver it. So we would have worked to be more efficient next year. And I just want to make sure the statement, we didn't charge that program for the admin, it was just routine operations. It didn't come out so that 100% of what you funded from employees, from citizens, went to those residents. So
Right. But I mean, I really appreciate the fact that, you know, Philip and everybody who's involved in it really did track, like, how much staff time did this take? Because at the end of the day, like, when you have to think about, like, how many staff do we need for next year? Like, that's real work that has to get done and it gets factored into the future planning and stuff like that. So I think it's right to account for it, you know, and if there's ways to make it not as big of a burden on our staff, as well as, you know, there's also the other part of it is like the amount of work that the citizens have to go through as well to access it to make sure it's a good benefit, but is there a way to make that as user friendly? Right. While having some accountability. But all right, I'm not hearing anything else right now, but Avril, like, if there are other things that commissioners want to say, okay, now knowing the picture we're in, like, if there's something else, like, what is the time frame that would be today? But okay, if it's not today, then when is the next deadline?
she said yesterday.
So I would say let's hear from the school district on the 10th, and after that, then we can add or subtract from the budget. So let's plan on the 10th to have all of the inputs that we can then finalize our budget at that point.
That sounds good. I would say, like, if there are ideas that people have, then definitely let Avril know. You know, let your colleagues know if there's other ideas, because we are getting, further into this now. So especially if it's anything, big. All right. Appreciate everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.